Excellent. So we are kicking off our speaker series for this year, and we have a fantastic one that we are incredibly excited about. Today will be Rhonda Nese, and then coming up through the winter and into the spring and early summer, we have Ann Gregory, Eileen Schwartz, Ginger Kwan, Emma Elliott Groves, and Janine Jones. This Smart Center speaker series, which I'm really happy to be able to introduce in my role as one of the Smart Center's co-directors, is brought to you by funding that we've received from the Institute of Education Sciences and a postdoctoral training grant that has really allowed us to kick off all of this, that one of our faculty members at the Smart Center, Eric Bruns, is PI on. We also have our Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center school mental health focused supplement. You can see that the Smart Center speaker series that we've laid out for this year has a strong focus on equity and inclusion and social justice. And we are incredibly excited to move forward with it, kicking off with Rhonda Nese today, who I will be introducing in just a moment. I want to begin sort of the content of our presentation with a land acknowledgement. This is kind of standard practice for the University of Washington Smart Center. And we want to acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. And we are grateful to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. I want to do a little bit of an overview of the Smart Center itself. That is my privilege as one of the Smart Center co-directors. I'm Aaron Lyon, an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Washington. And at the Smart Center, we're very focused on two gaps. One is access and utilization of services, and the other is enhancing service quality. We really see these as complementary and interconnected, where no matter how accessible a service is, if that service is not of high quality, it's not going to have the kind of public health and well-being impact that it has the potential to have. Likewise, even the most effective evidence-based intervention with large effect sizes isn't going to be particularly useful from a public health perspective, from an overall societal well-being perspective, unless it's accessible. That's one of the things that drives us to do so much of our work in education and in schools, based on data that we and so many of our colleagues have collected, showing that schools continue to be the most common setting for the delivery of youth mental health services. So the Smart Center's mission is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all students through research, training, technical assistance, and support to policymaking. Here you can see us from just a little over a year ago, back when gathering didn't seem quite so triggering or quite so uncomfortable, and was much more kind of how we lived our lives. And we're looking forward to getting back there once we get through this winter. So that you can get more information about the Smart Center on Twitter, on our website. This is just a reminder of the kinds of things that we have there, including information about our different projects, publications, as well as upcoming events such as the one that we're at today. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our Northwest MHTTC, that's Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, school mental health team that helps to make all of this possible and is part of our extra applied work, where we support throughout Region 10 of the U.S. School mental health services broadly defined, including direct training and technical assistance on the implementation of services and evidence-based practices, building infrastructure, supporting educational leaders to promote mental health services for all. This is led by Kelsey Schmitz and Megan Lucy, Natalie Flores, and Eric Bruns. So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Rhonda Nese. And Rhonda Nese is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Special Education and Clinical Sciences at the University of Oregon, and principal investigator within educational and community supports. She's been PI or co-PI on, I believe, at least 4 Institute of Education Sciences grants focused on things such as team-initiated problem solving within multi-tiered systems of support, predictors of implementation and sustainment of evidence-based practices, developing alternatives to out-of-school suspensions. She also provides technical assistance to state, district, and school-level teams. She was originally going to be one of our speakers for last year's speaker series before our speaker series and so much in our world was significantly disrupted by the pandemic we still find ourselves in. But we are very excited to have her here today. She was also the opening keynote at the Northwest PBIS conference back in February, which I think was actually the last in-person conference that many of us Smarties attended. And we are looking forward to doing those sorts of in-person things again in the future. We are heartened by some of the recent news that we've all been taking a look at related to the development of vaccines. It might take a while to roll out, but even as we head into the winter, I think we can do so with optimism. And as part of that optimism, I am very happy and excited to turn it over to Dr. Rhonda Nese. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyons. I am so happy to be here and to be able to join all of you. Yes, I believe that for the Northwest PBIS conference, which took place in Tacoma, Washington, that was in February. That was the last time I stepped foot on an airplane. So, you know, fingers crossed with vaccine and with more prevention, hopefully we will be back to a place where we can gather again very soon. So today I'm going to be talking about the process that we've embarked upon over the past 5 or 6 years on developing an instructional alternative to exclusionary discipline practices. Before I begin, it's very important for me to recognize and honor that the work that I am sharing with you is not just mine and mine alone. I have a remarkable team of scholars and students that I get to collaborate with every single day that has helped take this work throughout our school districts and throughout both our state here in Oregon and across the United States. The work that we have done would also not be possible without funding from both foundational donors as well as our federal government. And so, you know, it's important that we have to put the disclaimer at the bottom that the views expressed here are mine and mine alone, but the work has been funded by our federal government. This is our taxpaying dollars hard at work. And so I'm grateful for our partnerships, and I'm grateful for all of you for inviting me to join you today, and for Meg and Lucy in particular for making the process of transitioning from an in-person presentation to doing this online so seamless and easy. So when I agreed to come and present and share my work with you over a year ago, we were at a time where none of us knew that we would find ourselves in this place where we couldn't be together and we couldn't gather. And at a time when not only ourselves, but our families, our communities, the schools, the students and their families that we support are in a place where we're consumed every single day with anxiety and worry about the health and the safety of those that we love and those that we serve, and the status of progress that we're making here in the United States. So my goal today is to create at least this space where we feel together, even though we're not physically in the same room. It breaks my heart that I can't see your faces, but so it goes with doing these things remotely. And so I just appreciate you being here with me and sharing in the work that is so important to many of us. So today, what this looks like, our agenda, I'm going to first kind of define broadly how I conceptualize and how we conceptualize exclusionary discipline practices and look at the impact that we know from decades of research that the use of exclusion has on the outcomes of students in our schools. I'm going to introduce to you a model that we call ISLA. It stands for the Inclusive Skill Building Learning Approach. I'm not good with acronyms, but in Arabic, which is a language that I speak, Islam means to restore. And so my goal is to share with you our model for bringing students and teachers together in a restorative and instructional framework to help students thrive in school and to reduce the use of our use of exclusionary discipline practices. I'm going to share with you some of our data, some of the feedback that we've gotten from our stakeholders, both students and teachers, and also present where we're going from here. Feel free to ask questions throughout within the chat box or in the chat box in the Q&A. We will be getting to it at the end. I can't see the chat box as I'm presenting, but my colleagues here are going to be monitoring it, and I've given them full authority to interrupt me at any time and ask. So to begin, I like to start off by defining exclusionary discipline practices because I don't think that we necessarily have a common accepted understanding of what it is. When we talk about exclusionary discipline or you read about the impact of it, we oftentimes stipulate on the impact that suspensions and expulsions have on student outcomes. For me, it's really important to show and define exclusionary discipline on this huge continuum, which ranges from really low-level exclusion, like taking timeouts in classrooms or sitting in the hall, to out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. It's important to frame it within this broader continuum, because what we know from a lot of the research that we see is that the severity of the exclusion, so the more severe the exclusion, being kicked out of school, is related to more severe long-term outcomes for students. However, it's important to recognize that even overuse of low-level exclusion, kicking kids out frequently or having them excluded from many different activities in class, but not actually leaving the school building, still results in poor outcomes for students. And what we know is that when students are kicked out of their learning environment, they miss out on a lot. We know that they miss out on academic instructional time, which is happening in the classroom, but they also miss out on being a part of a learning community, which is where we belong, especially K-12. Our school is where we spend the majority of our time, and that is our community. And that is also where we learn crucial social skills that will serve us for the rest of our lives, right? It's within the classroom that we learn how to work together, how to take performance feedback, how to ask and answer questions, how to listen, how to reflect and take a stance on a point. It is within the classroom that we learn these skills. And when we are excluded from those environments, not only do we oftentimes struggle academically, but we struggle to learn those really important pro-social skills that the classroom is the foundation for developing. We also know from research that that school to prison pipeline is an indisputable thing, that harsh and disproportionate discipline in schools for non-threatening behaviors. And I emphasize this because when we look at national data, we know that the majority of students are not being suspended because they are bringing weapons to school, but they are suspended most often for the most subjective of behaviors: defiance, disrespect, and disruption. And when we talk about the disproportionality of the discipline around those subjective behaviors, we see that our students of color, students living in poverty, students struggling academically, students receiving special education services are the ones who are at greatest risk of receiving those. We know that that discipline is linked to school failure, dropout, substance abuse, and incarceration. These are things that we have known for 30 plus years of research, and we're at a place where people are doing something about it now. Because I work with mostly secondary school, so middle and high school, people often want to know, because we know from national data that suspensions are most often used in middle schools, because by high school, students can drop out, that just one out of school suspension in 9th grade is associated with a 50% increase in dropping out and a 19% decrease in any post-secondary enrollment. So that is vocational school, that is community college, that's four-year university. We also know that even when you control for other risk factors, like being a part of a group of peers who gets in trouble a lot, for example, receiving an out-of-school suspension is a significant predictor of future antisocial behavior. So we oftentimes play into what is expected of us. If we get the message that we are bad, we start behaving that way, regardless of the other risk factors that may be present in our lives. It's also important to note that in our study of exclusion, that much of exclusion is based on this bad apple theory. I have to remove this bad apple to save the other 35 kids in my class. And what we know from research is that bad apple theory is not in fact correct in this application. So in a study that was put out by the American Psychological Association, they found that schools with the highest rates of out-of-school suspension had the lowest rates of school-wide achievement and perceptions of school safety amongst the entire student body, specifically students who never got suspended. So students who never got suspended from school struggled more academically and reported feeling less safe in school. And for those of you, including myself, who have worked in schools that had really high rates of suspension, we know that what we oftentimes don't see in those schools is a lot of prevention. We don't see prevention before that hammer comes down on kids, that any act that goes contrary to what's expected in the classroom is seen as willful defiance, as opposed to a skill gap. We also know, and many of you know, as I mentioned before, that exclusionary discipline is most often used with students of color, students with disabilities, and students struggling academically and those living in poverty. And here's where we see our intersection of race and disability. So a national study found that 18% of students with disabilities in our nation had been suspended. However, 1 in 5 districts in the country suspended over 50% of its Black male students with disabilities. So when I look at these data, what I see is that the students who need to be in school the most, the students that deserve and need the most support, are the ones who are being kicked out most often. And I think as an educator, the thing that is most frustrating about out-of-school suspensions or exclusionary practices in general is that they are ineffective at changing student behavior. And that there is this coercive cycle that oftentimes happens where a student, say, engages in inappropriate behavior in the classroom and gets kicked out. And that student is now missing out on academic instruction. So by the time they come back into class, now they're further behind academically when maybe they didn't have an academic issue beforehand. And now they're going to engage in more unwanted behavior to escape instruction, because most of us and most of our students would rather look bad than stupid. And so we will do that and then get kicked out again. And that coercive cycle continues, and it's to the disservice of students and to the disservice of the teachers and the other kids as well. The other thing that I note is that when we look at other data, there was one study that found nationally 1 in 3 students had been suspended at one point in their K-12 schooling. So when I see that, 1 in 3 is a lot. And if suspension served as a deterrent, right, it deterred kids from engaging in behaviors that were inappropriate, then maybe that number would be justified. However, another study found that students who were suspended at the beginning of the school year, August, September, October, 72% of them received further discipline later on in the school year, which shows that not only is out-of-school suspension ineffective at changing behavior, it actually, in fact, makes things worse. And so the important thing for us to recognize as we move into what do we do about this is that relying on office discipline referrals, suspensions, or detentions to change behavior is not ever going to work. Why? Because you can't punish skills into a kid. We don't just keep bringing down the hammer until poof, one day the student recognizes what they've done. I have to be honest, in my years of working in schools, I never ever saw a student who came back from being suspended and was like, I've seen the error of my ways. I am ready to commit to this learning environment. I'm going to thrive. That's not typically what happens. What we know is for substantive behavior change, what is critical is that we provide ample opportunities to instruct and practice appropriate behaviors. Because the truth is, when it comes to developing academic skills and developing behavior skills, we learn these things one and the exact same way. With academics and behaviors, somebody teaches us the skill, they model the skill, they give us the opportunity to practice that skill, and they provide us performance feedback. It is the same way. And so when it comes to an academic skill gap, we would never, if a student said 2 + 2 = 7, say, no, I've told you that a million times that is wrong, out you go. We wouldn't kick them out of class for that. We would reteach the skill, try a different strategy, praise them when they got it right, give them stuff that meets their level and help them thrive. And so what we want is to see behavior change or the development of pro-social skills in the exact same way. That students deserve the opportunity to learn these things, to practice them, to have people who model it for them. And if we get it wrong, to have other opportunities and different strategies to try it. And when we do it right, receiving ongoing acknowledgement of how hard we're working, of how well we're doing is so crucial. All of us thrive with recognition of our effort and of our work. We also need to make sure that we incorporate, and what we'll focus on today is instructional responses to unwanted behavior. Instructional, not punitive. These would be something that we would call effective consequences. An effective consequence reduces the likelihood that an unwanted behavior is going to happen again. So teaching, for example, is the most effective consequence we have, right? And so we will focus today on what teaching and reconnecting looks like. I want to share with you a quote that really drives the work that I do and the way that I feel about our supports for students, and it is this. I have come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It's my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated and a child humanized or dehumanized. The work that we do, your supports as educators and scholars, it is so crucial for us to really focus on when we talk about school-wide PBIS or MTSS, we are talking about changing adult behavior, not changing kids, but changing adult behavior, because it is our behaviors that change and affect whether students learn and thrive or whether or not they struggle. And so when I look at the model that I use to incorporate these elements into our research, for me, so first of all, for those of you who are familiar with school-wide PBIS, I really struggle to present school-wide PBIS without using a triangle, but I did it today, just for you. I like this image that really focuses on the critical elements of work that is effective at change. So when we look at this model, we are focused on practices that support student behavior. We are focused on systems that support staff behavior. And we are focused on using data continuously to inform the decisions that we make. We use this model to really help us get out those outcomes that we want for all of our children. We want them to thrive academically. We want them to have healthy interpersonal relationships, connections with other students and adults. We want them to feel socially competent. We want them to feel safe, and we want them to thrive. In essence, we want the next generation to be better than us in every way. As a parent, as an educator, this is what I want for all children, my children here at home, as well as others, for all of them to be better than us. And so we use these practices to get at that. And so when I think about data, practices, and systems, when it comes to any intervention that I develop or the work that I do or what we look at in schools, say if you have multiple interventions going on, what I want you to ask is, do these practices include all of these elements? And so for our model that I'm going to be sharing with you today, the ISLA model, we have systems within our classroom and within our teaming structure. We have restorative and instructional components, which are our practices, and we utilize our data to inform the iterative changes that we make. And so I'm going to focus on these three components today, and I want to bring it to you in a different model. The way in which we implement ISLA in schools is that we work with a team. We always work with a team because that team guides the decision-making, they guide implementation within the schools. Using a team is so crucial because previously we've used or maybe perhaps you guys are in environments where you use kind of that hero model where you have a school counselor or an administrator, somebody who's really passionate about something. Say they're really passionate about bullying prevention. And so they bring this intervention into the school and they guide it, they oversee it. And then when that person gets another job somewhere else because they're really good at what they do, that intervention leaves with them. So we build this work within a team so that it has legs and sustainability. We also embed it in practices that the schools already have going on. So if you have MTSS in place, we braid ISLA with MTSS so that it is seen as part of that tiered structure. I like to think of ISLA as tier 1+ because we start here with preventative classroom practices. And that is the foundation of the work that we do because we know if classrooms are engaging, supportive, there are clear, healthy relationships and supports between teachers and students where it's an environment that is respectful and engaging, we see low levels of problems happening and low levels of kids getting kicked out. And so we spend a lot of time with our school staff really, really boosting up our preventative classroom practices. I will get into each element of this. When we have that strong, we also layer on in class effective responses to behaviors. And within the classroom, we are looking at those effective consequences we talked about. We're looking at graduated discipline. We're also looking at having systematized breaks and how students and teachers can request a break when a situation gets heated or when they cannot focus. On that, we layer on out of class ISLA supports because what we want to do is set up a framework in which responses to behaviors or instructional alternatives to exclusion start with prevention and have these layers before students are ever sent out of class. The out of class supports include instruction and restorative supports to get kids back to class faster and with skills and give them the opportunity to have a resolution with their teachers, to reconnect and identify as a team if students are in need of additional supports. So let's jump in first to our preventative classroom practices. So within ISLA, one thing that we spend a lot of time doing is developing our structure for having universal or tier 1 relationship building with kids. And so what does this look like in a class of 37? We work with schools and with educators on these three critical elements: welcoming students at the door, owning your environment, that is establishing, teaching, praising, modeling expected routines, behaviors, engagement, and then wrapping up class with intention. So let's break this down. So welcoming students at the door, the first component, is something that is, it seems and sounds so easy and so simple and sweet, and it is those things, and it is remarkably effective at changing student behavior and impacting student behavior. So what does welcoming students at the door look like? It looks like setting a positive tone, promoting a sense of a sense of belonging and building trust, and it costs nothing. And there are schools, we have seen examples of teachers doing this in many different ways, right? Some stand at the door and greet each student as they come in. Some do a class-wide greeting when the students gather. Some go table to table as kids get set up. For us, it's important that we always take these elements back to the science. And from our colleague Clay Cook, we know that the simple act of greeting students, just that simple act, resulted in this study in an increase in academic engagement for the students in the school, that's the green bar, the schools that received it, and a decrease in disruptive behaviors. Just greeting students And that's why I say it's not just touchy-feely, this is science. And talk about something that gives you the biggest bang for your buck. It costs nothing, it's no prep, and it results in really remarkable outcomes for kids. It's also important for me to acknowledge that with the way in which we do ISLA in schools these days, we are giving people opportunities to say, what does it look like to welcome students at the door in person? And then what does this look like in virtual learning? Because as we know, even when we go back to school, hugging, high fives, shaking hands may not be something that we're going to return to for a while. So it is important for us to connect with educators and be open-minded and be collaborative in the ways in which we do this. The second component is owning your environment. And for me, I even think about this with, like even with my own kids, being like a duck, where your feet are kind of pedaling under the water, but on top, on the surface, you're cool as a cucumber. I think about what Michelle Obama had famously said about when they go low, we go high, right? We all have had those moments where a student escalates or there's an issue and then we escalate, or someone yells and then we yell and then everything erupts and it's a mess. And this is an example of what it looks like to model emotional regulation, to model connection, to be supportive of kids. And so when they go high, we remain low and calm and connected. But this also looks like identifying those routines or those expectations in your classroom and teaching what they look like. So what is your expectation around using cell phones in class or entering class late or turning in assignments? What is it that we want to see students doing? What is the appropriate way to engage in your classroom? Okay, we need to identify how and when we are going to teach students those routines. And the same thing is for online learning. We have gone into an environment of online learning that for many of us was completely foreign, and for many of our students was completely foreign. And so being able to teach online etiquette, to model online etiquette, to extend grace, that we're all learning this together, is so critical, because the way that you would teach what it looks like to be engaged in your classroom or be respectful in the classroom, it's important that we do the same online. The last component is wrapping up class with intention. We know, all of us, that transitions are a notorious time for trouble, that many of us struggle with it, from babies or toddlers transitioning off the playground, getting back into the car, to children in middle school or high school going from one class period to the other, or going from lunch back into the learning environment. And so being able to proactively address that crucial moment of transition in a really positive way, to wrap things up with a purpose and then send kids to the next period or to the next transition on a positive note, is so important. And so this, like others, there are many examples that we have. And unfortunately, because our time today is limited and is not a 2-day training on ISLA, I'm giving you guys, the drive-by version of what this looks like. But there are examples of what it looks like within the classroom. So I wanted to share with you one.
It's appreciation, apology, or aha.
The closing circle activity was called the 3 A's: appreciation, apologies, and ahas. So the whole purpose is just to have some space to reflect on our day.
All I want you to do is to stand around the room somewhere in a circle while we do our brief shout out.
People can either identify an appreciation they have, an apology they have, or an aha, a moment where there's like a light bulb moment in their head.
My aha was that race is not the only part of our identity. So can we get a few people to shout out an appreciation, apology, or aha?
I want to appreciate Jonathan. He helped me kind of figure out where I wanted to go with my personal statement.
I think those types of appreciations or community recognitions can go a long way to build the bonds. That's the whole point, right? Building community.
I apologize for having my headphones in half of the time to everyone.
Thanks a lot for that, Carlos. That means a lot. It's appreciation.
And so there are many examples of how other educators, I love that example because it shows how easy it can be and how much it builds community. And for many of us, we think, oh my gosh, but my time with the students is limited. I have to get through all of this. but think about the payoff and think about the benefit that incorporating even the smallest of transitions, of the smallest of these wrap-ups could do for your students. So here are a couple examples from other schools. One is where a teacher has a board where they say, what is the question to this answer? So the answer is Helen Keller. And this is another opportunity to engage in whether or not the students are understanding the content, understanding the lesson around Helen Keller, where they get to share a question or something that's stuck with the students for that week. There are also many activities and ways in which we can wrap up class with intention through distance learning, through digital exit tickets, through closing circles, through ending class with acknowledgements, through doing a session of meditation or yoga. We have a member of our research team by the name of Saki Malosi, who oftentimes does for us a mindfulness meditation activity for the last 5 minutes of our research team meetings on Zoom. And so being able to do that, it not only feels good in the moment, Saki is setting up even our research team for the next transition. Many of us are going into another Zoom meeting or transitioning into an activity. And so after spending so much time on Zoom, it calms us, it brings us down, and it moves us on in a positive note. So as we spend a lot of time on these preventative classroom practices, I want to go back to our image and point out the fact that that blue stair of preventative classroom practices of building relationships extends throughout the supports that we do. We don't just stop doing them because a student needs more individualized instruction or because things have gotten challenging or there was a mishap. We always come back to those relationships. And part of building relationships is also having effective responses when we see students engaging in behaviors that are not okay, whether in person in our classrooms or online. And when I say an effective response, what are we talking about? We're talking about responses that are calm and respectful, that are discreet, that consider the function or the why. Why is a student talking while I am instructing? Why is a student late to class every time? Can we address that? And can we address that by focusing on building skills and responding in a way that matches the severity? The discretion of effective responses is so critical because when we have done our focus groups, we do focus groups through our study each year with 8th grade students. One of the biggest things that has come up when we've asked them, what makes it challenging to return to class after there's been an issue or there's been some sort of blow up? And students have notoriously said, being called out in front of everybody, being embarrassed in front of my peers makes me never want to come back into that classroom. Students want to be treated the same way that we do, right? With respect and with kindness. And they expect us as adults to be their bigger person in situations that are challenging because their frontal lobes are not fully developed, but ours are. And so if I show up late to a meeting, when we used to have in-person meetings, if one of my colleagues called me out and was like, you're late again, Rhonda, in front of everybody, I mean, nobody would do that to us as adults. Or I worked with a school who, if students were late to class, they would lock the door. And so students would be at the door trying to open up a locked door. I can't imagine being locked out of a meeting by my colleagues. And I'm late and I forget my supplies sometimes. I forget a pen or, I'm scrambling, or I come in and I ask a question, what did I miss? Right? And so students are asking for that same grace. It's been really, really clear in the research that we have done. So when we look at effective responses, what are the most effective responses? Teaching and reteaching appropriate behaviors, requesting a change, inviting a student to self-correct, partnering students with another student who's on task, modifying an assignment, doing a mini conference. And for those of you, you're looking at this and saying, that just looks like great classroom management. And it is. The most effective responses to behaviors that are unwanted are these great classroom management practices of reteaching, providing models, partnering kids with others. And it's the same for online learning, right? Muting everyone during instruction to reduce the likelihood that they're going to be talking out or interrupting, disabling chat boxes, or, really considering why, especially now, we should never exclude students from distance learning. I mean, we are all so isolated as it is that in the classroom, that connecting on Zoom may be the only time in which some of your students are seeing others. One of the activities that we do with schools in identifying effective responses to common behaviors is that we look at their discipline referrals. And so here are these three right here are examples that we pulled in our work with one of our schools. One of the common reasons that students were being kicked out of class, students refusing to take off their hoodies, students side talking when a teacher is talking. This was one that, they were discussing organisms in science class, and a student said a word that is very similar to organisms. Okay. And so when we were talking about the why is it that they're doing these things? We go through this activity where we identify what's the possible motivation. The students are refusing to take off their hoodie because maybe they're cold. And that is a reasonable reason to be wearing a sweatshirt or possibly putting a hoodie on. So what is the issue with wearing a hoodie? The issue that teachers have identified is that they can't see the student's face. That is a major issue. You don't know if they're engaged, if they're falling asleep, what have you. And so for this one school, the teachers were saying it's okay for students to put on hoodies if they're cold, as long as we can see their face. We talked about talking out in class, and they said a possible motivation, sometimes students need materials, and this student in particular was asking a classmate to borrow something. So teaching the students that if you need materials, just raise your hand, or whatever that classroom expectation is within your environment, doing it. The last one was the student was saying another word that sounded like organisms because they thought it was funny and they wanted attention from their peers. And they said, what's the most effective response? Ignoring it and giving that peer, if that's what they want, if they want attention, if they want to be funny, giving them attention for doing the right thing. Letting that student earn extra recess for the entire class by being engaged in the lesson, right? Tons of positive attention, but for doing the right thing. And so really understanding motivation is so crucial. We also do this in an effort to be able to delineate between what we want our staff managing in the classroom versus what office managed is. And I say this because in the work that we do, and in even the data that I presented in the beginning, what I hope is that educators, when we work together, they see kicking kids out of class as a really big deal. As a really big deal, because we know and we see the impact that being excluded from the learning environment has on students. And so sending students out should be reserved for the most serious of behaviors where you cannot support that student in the classroom environment. And so you're sending them out to ask for help from others, from administrators, from front office staff in addressing the issue, right? Not sending kids out for low-level stuff like not having materials, for example, or being tardy. I can't think of a more asinine response to being late to class, or to, a more asinine response to missing class than to miss more class. Like, it doesn't make sense, but we've seen this happen over and over again. And so what we also look at is what I like to call the big deal-o-meter. This is something that our research team does with schools. And let me tell you, this is not a research term. I Googled meter and I stuck one on a PowerPoint slide for you, because we go through this activity with our schools to identify and to help teachers and staff collaborate on what's a big deal in this environment and what is not. And so for one of our middle schools, cursing was a low-level thing. And I say a low-level thing not to mean that it's appropriate to be cursing in class, but that educators were saying with middle and high schoolers, even elementary school, we want to go up and say to the student, hey, you know what? That behavior is just not acceptable here, okay? Not in the classroom, and move on. Because it would be a waste of resources and time to kick a kid out for saying a bad word in class, right? And there is a difference between cursing versus having weapons. There is a difference between minor fighting versus jumping a student. And so when we do this with staff, this is an example, and this is one of a principal from one of the schools that we had worked with. They printed out the most common reasons that kids were being kicked out of class, put them on little slips of paper, and set them all over the table. And all of the teachers had the opportunity to grab these behaviors and put them on the big deal-o-meter where they thought they went. And what was surprising to staff when they do this is to see just how many behaviors are actually on the low level in their opinions, yet still resulted in kids being excluded from class. So just another example of an activity to calibrate and get us on the same page about what is classroom managed and what is office managed. Being able to have these systems that are consistent and predictable is so important, because inconsistency breeds disproportionality. So when I have a different response to a student having a cell phone versus another teacher. The likelihood that one student gets kicked out over another, or that because these environments are inconsistent, that there is harsh and disproportionate discipline for our students of color, our students at risk of academic failure, goes up. So being able to get consistency is so, so important. The other element that we focus on with effective responses is about having systematized breaks. We want to move away from the practices of having kids step out into the hallway and sit out there. Sitting in the hallway typically only results in kids getting into getting into more trouble. Why? Because you know, and I know when we were in middle school, if somebody kicked me out of class and I was sitting in the hallway, my body started to move and I started to walk. And chances were I started peeking the windows of other classrooms and then I got yelled at again, right? That happens. And so we want to move away from that. If students need a break, what do breaks look like? There is a difference between an in-class break versus an out-of-class break. And what we want to show is that whether it's an in-class break or an out-of-class break, that the time is limited, that the student has an activity to work on, that there is an opportunity for either the student to request a break or for the teacher to request a break, that there is a moment for the student and the teacher to reconnect before the student returns back to learning, and that we do this in a way that identifies if a student has needs that are outside of what we could provide in the classroom. So here you'll see a note, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through exactly how we build break systems, but the slides will be available. I want you to see that what we have here is that if a teacher finds that they need to ask a student to take a break 3 times in 1 week, that is a critical moment of putting in a request for support to your behavior team or your tier 2 team or reaching out for help, because being asked to take a break multiple times in a week is an indicator of something much bigger and an indicator of a student maybe needing more support, right? This is how we use these systems in a way of prevention and identification. The next component is moving into our out-of-class supports for students. So you've utilized all of your great classroom management practices, you've built relationships, you've supported students, you have really clear ways of responding to behavior within the classroom environment and reducing the likelihood that you'll use exclusion. And then there is a moment in which you feel that the student needs more help. What does more help look like? So for us, it looks like a system that is built on prevention, that reduces the amount of instructional time that a student is missing and provides moments of skill development and reconnection with their staff member. Specifically, those components when a student is sent out include a student debrief, and I'll go through each of these in just a moment. A debrief with a student, skills coaching on appropriate behavior, developing a plan for them re-entering the classroom and practicing that to set students up for success, and transitioning students back to class with supports, okay? So I know that this flow chart has a lot of words, and so we won't spend a lot of time on this, but what I want to show you is that we start with a student being sent out for unwanted behavior, but having written documentation or a call to the person who's going to receive this student about what exactly happened. Because when a student comes in, this is what we call our triage process, and it was built from a problem that we were seeing in a school that I was working with many years ago, where the front office was loaded up with kids and there was no clear reason why some were sent and some weren't. And when the administrator and I started tracking how much instructional time students were missing for just sitting and waiting in the office, they were missing on average over 1,200 minutes of instruction, which was 3 days, which is crazy. But in this pileup of students were sent to the office to sit and wait to meet with an administrator because there was no triage process in place of being able to identify students who need support, providing them the support and getting them back to class. And so what I want you to see is that with our triage, and again, this is in the handouts, and so you'll be able to read the details more thoroughly. that there is no escaping instruction, whether or not a student meets with an ESLA support staff member, which in many of our schools is either the front office secretary, an educational assistant or paraprofessional that has historically housed, say, an in-school suspension or detention room. Like, we are re-envisioning their job descriptions and their responsibilities. So whether they're being supported by an ESLA support staff member or an administrator, there's no escaping instruction and reconnection. None of this triage says you've been sent to the administrator because the behavior was a safety concern and the administrator is then going to suspend you. So the reason that the debrief is so important is when students are sent out of class and they come to the front office, imagine that the written documentation, the referral or the phone call from the teacher tells you the teacher's perspective of what happened and why the student was sent out. A debrief allows a student to identify from their perspective what happened in the class with an adult who supports them and is going to be engaging and non-threatening and non-judgmental. This is not only the opportunity for the student to share what they thought happened, but also to identify their why, their function, their motivation for what happened in class, how it impacted them and others, and what would be an appropriate alternative moving forward, because that appropriate alternative is then worked through behavioral skills coaching, where the person who's supporting the kid says, okay, so in the future, instead of talking out or talking to a peer, you're going to raise your hand. Okay, let's practice that. Remember what I said earlier about academics and behavior being learned the same way? Behavior skills coaching is exactly that. It is an opportunity to identify the appropriate skill, teach and model it, practice it through role play, and provide feedback to the student, as well as communication to their staff member or to the teacher about here's what we worked on. The student is then supported through working through what we call reconnection conversations. So we know that students who get kicked out of class, recidivism is historically very high. So for students who have gotten suspended, the likelihood that they get suspended again goes up. Right? Students who have been kicked out, the likelihood that they get kicked out again goes up. And so we're trying to interrupt that through another process, which is reconnecting. Because as many of you know, when students are sent out of class or they come back from, say, being suspended, a lot of times there's not often this bridge back to class. There's not a reentry plan. There's not a reconnection and a making amends and a plan for success. Kids come back. A lot of times they're met with a teacher saying, you're back already. And the likelihood that problems happen again goes up. So our reconnection happens in two ways. It happens face-to-face between the teacher and the student, as well as on a card that the student either hands to the teacher or puts in their mailbox. What we call this is a double dose of a positive interaction. We're really trying to improve these relationships because we know that relationship is crucial for whether or not the student is going to stay in that classroom and thrive. And so here's an example of what our reconnection card looks like from a middle school who does work with us. So you'll see that it's broken down, and this is, they write it out with the person who supports them, as well as they say it to the teacher when they go back. We'll go through what that looks like in just a moment. It shares what they learned, how they're going to make things better, how they're going to try and prevent what had happened from happening again in the future, the supports they need from that teacher for the student to be successful, which I have to say, when we've done our qualitative interviews with staff members, this was one of those components that they liked the most. In order for me to be successful, the support I need from you is, they were saying, this has been great because it gives students the opportunity to self-advocate and to tell the teacher, here's how you can help me. We've also added something else I want you to know about me, what I'm really good at, what's really hard for me, what's going on in my life. And then something I need you to know about me from a cultural perspective, traditions, beliefs, my family. Because a lot of times what we see in our schools is that the traditions, the beliefs, the values of our students and our teachers and their cultures and races may not match. And a lot of times that may be a point of friction or problems. So let's look at a couple examples from some students. These are just a couple I pulled out. Dear Mr. Lyons, I learned that I make mistakes often and I haven't put in much effort to put it to a stop. I can make things better by focusing on fixing the problem more often or when it starts to occur. Here is how I'm going to try and prevent this from happening again. Next time, I will try and stop the problem before it becomes too big. In order for me to be successful, the support I need from you is to give me more chances. I know you give me plenty, but this time you didn't. And here is something else I want you to know. I have struggled with this and being hyper since kindergarten, and I don't know why. Really, really an opportunity for a teacher and a student to share this moment of what's been difficult for the student. Here's another example. I learned, and now with a couple of these examples, you may not know why was the student sent out. For here, this one, for example, you're going to look at it and say, that's not a reason for kicking a kid out, okay? But so listen to this. The student said, I learned not to tap my pencil and to have my head on the desk, okay? That's why the student was sent out of class, which is not a good reason. I can make things better by copying the notes on the board. Here's how I'm going to try and prevent this from happening again. Copying the notes on the board and not having my head on the desk and not tapping. In order for me to be successful, the support I need from you is to show me how to do this in a way that I understand. Something else I want you to know is that I have no clue how to do this type of math. Now, when you look at the reason the student was kicked out and you look at their admission that they are struggling with this, what are signs that we are oftentimes struggling or exhausted, stressed, or tired or frustrated? We put our head down, we feel tired, we tap out of nervousness. And so I just want you to see that this is another example of how students and teachers can connect on what students need to thrive. And so I want to say that I love this image. It says, I just wrote that referral 5 minutes ago. Why is he back in my class with a teddy bear and a starburst? That is not at all what we're doing. What we are focused on is bringing kids back to class with skills, which is different than traditional detention, in-school suspension, or sitting out in the hallway, where they sit idle, staring at a wall, learning and doing nothing. And then we expect them to come back and be better and be fixed. And there was nothing that we did. Remember, you can't punish skills into a kid. So we're taking these opportunities to help build up their skills, as well as the skill of making amends, which is something that many of us know adults that struggle with. We struggle with making amends. I have to tell you, I am an avid NPR listener, and one of my favorite studies was that there were these researchers who wanted to see what people wanted most in a life partner. And so they did this survey of like thousands and thousands of individuals, and they mixed together human qualities and dog qualities. And not surprising, people identified that the 3 characteristics that they wanted most in a life partner were dog qualities: playful, excited to see me when I come home, doesn't hold a grudge. So that doesn't hold a grudge, helping teachers and students make amends and move forward is so crucial. People don't want to be married to someone who holds grudges and keeps bringing things up the next day. The nice thing about the reconnection conversation is it allows students the opportunity to share what they learned, how they would make things better, how the teacher can make things better, and it gives them the opportunity to say, tomorrow we start fresh. Because what we focus on in our training with staff is when students return to you, allow them to do their reconnection, allow them to say their part, do this without holding a grudge, without retribution, without further punishment. Allow the student to rejoin the class without a further conversation. Trust that that point has already been driven home. They were supported in identifying what happened, what should be done instead, and practicing those skills. And the truth is that many adults say, I've already spent how much time with this student, I'm going to spend how much more? The reconnection conversation should take no more than 3 minutes. And what we ask is that the student is supported in going back to class when the teacher is ready to receive them, okay? So the person in the office oftentimes calls the teacher and says, hey, Samantha is ready to do her reconnection conversation with you. Do you have a moment? And what we hope is that teachers step out into the hall and that this is not a production in front of everybody else, but that they allow the student to say their part. And then the teacher says something positive. Thank you for reconnecting with me. I appreciate your apology. It sounds great. Let's get back to work. Tomorrow we start fresh. If they're transitioning to the next period, have a great rest of the day. I'll see you tomorrow, right? These are really important. And I know these things, you're like, yes, we know to do these. We all connect with kids all the time, but oftentimes we forget, or we want to get into it and belabor the issue and wax poetic about how they destroyed our learning environment. It is important to identify that students, just like adults, make mistakes. We want to allow them the opportunity to make amends with us and for us to make amends as well, because modeling that is so important, and for us to move on. So to share with you a little bit of the research and the findings that we've done. So in our original pilot study, before the federal government had funded funded ISLA to be further developed, what we did is we took ISLA into a couple of middle schools, and we did trainings in 3 parts. We did trainings for the whole staff, trainings for the paraprofessional who was and the individuals in the front office who would support kids, as well as for the administrators. And what we found, let me see, hopefully you guys can see my little arrow. Here is office discipline referrals, in-school suspensions, and out-of-school suspensions. The black bar was before we implemented ISLA, the gray bar was after. In our schools, we saw a reduction in all exclusionary discipline practices. For my scientists out there, the Cohen's H is an effect size for 2 proportions. So that's what you see at the bottom. And so the rule of thumb is that this magnitude is significant in the learning environment, in educational practices. But the biggest jump that we saw was in the reduction of the amount of minutes of instructional time that students were missing on average when they were sent out of class. So in this one school, the amount of instructional time that students were missing when they were sent out went from over 1,100 minutes of instruction missed down to 75. And for another school, it went from an average of a day and a half, so 563 minutes of instructional time missed, down to 45. Now, it doesn't take 75 or 45 minutes to go through the ISLA process, but that's accounting for somebody supporting a kid while other kids are waiting. I also want to make clear that for these schools, those numbers pre-implementation were incredibly high because, as I said, students were just sitting in the office waiting to meet with an administrator. And what at that time these administrators had, the only tool in their toolbox was, for one of our schools, a 2-day in-school suspension. So on average, kids were sitting there for a day waiting to meet with an administrator, and then they were handed a 2-day in-school suspension. And so that's why they had historically missed so much instruction. Right now, we are moving into our 3rd year. After that pilot study, we were funded for a development grant from IES. And so our 1st year, we worked with middle schools to take our ISLA model and to refine it and make it better for the schools in which we were supporting. And so we got a lot of feedback from staff and a lot of feedback from students, and we made so many modifications, even to our reconnection card. It first started with "I'm sorry for," and it was really clear from students and staff that saying sorry was a very triggering thing, that people wanted to talk about what they learned, because in many instances, it wasn't always the student's fault. And I know that many of you know that it's like, they're apologizing for what? Can we talk about what we learned? Because everybody has a part to play in making amends. And so we modified that even to those fine details. Then we took that improved intervention and implemented it in an additional pair of middle schools. And so we were funded to do this work in middle schools, even though we have done it in high schools as well. But because nationally, middle schools, like I had said earlier, have the highest rates of suspension in the country. And so we implemented that refined intervention in those middle schools, made further modifications, and then going into our pilot year, we spent so much of the summer developing and taking our 6 training modules, which is how we implement the ISLA intervention, and developing them for distance learning and for online PD. We wanted to be able to have the flexibility to do both, because as many of you know, that is exactly what we're doing. In Oregon, at least where I am in Oregon, our students are 100% virtual, and it looks like they're going to be that for a while. So we are working with schools in a different fashion. So in year 1, we surveyed our staff as we were putting this in place, and the feedback that we had gotten from staff was that ESOL is an acceptable intervention in middle schools, that it's effective in meeting the goals of reducing exclusionary practices. And we learned a lot from our staff. So I wanted to pull out just a few quotes from our staff and our students to share with you. So here staff had said, ESOL appears to take students' voices into account and help them be heard by school staff. This then allows for staff and students to communicate and understand each other. The least beneficial part is the possibility that students will believe that these conversations are not genuine and are just a part of the process. And what we heard from students was that it feels like it's not genuine when they're going back to a class where they truly believe that the teacher does not like them and does not want them there. And so for us, it's really important that we recognize when we are doing this, we're not just building relationships, we're also trying to improve trust. And so students have said to us before, this teacher doesn't like me, so with the reconnection, I want the teacher to go first. I don't want to say my part first, because I'm worried that once I do, the teacher's going to trample all over me, which is so heartbreaking. But that is an important component for us to recognize, that being genuine and truly wanting the best for students, they can recognize it very quickly. Another educator had said, I think our taking part in the ESOL model has made our students' performance change, because even though we have always worked through issues verbally with the students, we are now asking them to reconnect with the teachers and take responsibility for their actions with the staff member. Students had a lot to say when we did our focus groups. I mean, it was remarkable the amount that students share about what works and what doesn't work for them, what makes the learning environment a supportive, engaging place where they want to be, and what makes it difficult for them to come back or to want to be in there. So one student had said in our focus groups, I feel like there are some kids that get called out more than others. Like I can see two kids doing the exact same thing, and because one doesn't have a great reputation, then they get instantly called out on, even if they weren't doing anything. This student spoke exactly to disproportionality. This is it, in a quote from a student, where two kids are doing the exact same thing, and this one has already been flagged as a problem, and so we see them getting dinged often. Another student had said some teachers send them down to the front office for the rest of the class period. And I feel like when they do that, it just makes it hard for the student because of the work that they missed and their homework. Sending them out and then bringing them right back makes it 10 times better. This was one of the reasons. So listening to students talk about what makes it challenging to come back to class, we took these quotes and shared them back with their staff. And it was remarkably powerful for staff to hear from students that they don't want kids missing out on a lot of class. They want to see teachers and kids making up and making things better. And that's why it's such a crucial part of our model. Students were also really clear about classrooms that they love to go to. And these two kids were like chomping at the bits to share about this one teacher. And we're like, what is it that this teacher does? And the student was like, Mr. Smith has this thing where every Monday he'll let people talk about what they did over the weekend. We'll just spend the first 15 minutes of everyone talking about what they did over the weekend. And for these students, so many of them reflected on this class as their most enjoyable class. And it was just because their teacher wanted to hear from them. That simple. Another student had said, when teachers admit that they make mistakes, that just calms you, that you're not alone. This came up so much with middle schoolers, talking about teachers who admit that they're human beings too. That this one student had said an example. He was like, one time in this class, I said a naughty word, and the teacher asked me to step out with her. And she said to me, listen, I say words like that all the time, but in here, we can't do that, okay? And the student was like, it just was cool that she told me, like, she cusses too, but at school I'm not allowed to cuss. And I asked the kid, has there been any issues in that class since then? And he was like, not at all. Just that simple act of recognizing that you're human too. And lastly, this student had said, I feel like when a class is welcoming, it's easier to focus and not as stressful, unlike a class that isn't welcoming. A way that a class can be welcoming is when a teacher greets you every day and supports you and helps everyone out. It truly makes a difference. So I bring these quotes in just to show that students were not asking for a lot. They're asking for connection. They're asking for human interaction. They're asking for someone to be interested in them and extend grace, that they make mistakes too. So in wrapping up, because I know that this is that I'm exactly out of time, I just wanted to share that because of the feedback we got from teachers and students, we made a considerable amount of changes to the materials that we had. We also changed our training and our PD model because we treat this as an ongoing conversation throughout the year, where we are meeting monthly. At staff meetings, there's a dosage. At our team meetings, there's a dosage where we're continuously watching our implementation. Our teams really focus on following our implementation checklist, sharing out with staff, gathering feedback, because what teachers do not want, and which has been made really clear, is to be told what to do. They want to be a part of these decision-making processes. They want to take an intervention and make it their own, and they do such a beautiful job with that. We collect a lot of data, and we also have a data system in which educators can see on average how much time are students missing when they're sent out, how many students have been sent out of class, so that we use our data to make decisions. We've also made considerable changes because of COVID. And so our study currently, which is it's an underpowered randomized control trial. We're doing a lot of our training and our data collection in different ways. And so we're doing a lot of our PD online. We're doing all of our PD online and gathering feedback from students in different ways. And so at this point, I'm going to wrap this up and just say thank you so much for having me here, for being a part of this. And I want this to hopefully be an opportunity for discussion. And I see Courtney, she's on here to share with me questions that have come up through this presentation. So thank you.
I just want to say thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I just kept wanting more and more strategies and examples, and you kept giving it to me, and it was just so great to hear. And I also want to thank everybody that's been listening. I know there was a lot of great questions and conversations going throughout the presentation, and a lot of people having back and forth about how can we use this in our own school and classroom. And I do apologize because your presentation was so great and you were giving us so many great strategies. We didn't leave any room for questions and answers. But
no.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
It was so good. No one wanted to stop you. So I am wondering, because there was a lot of great questions, if it would be okay with you if I kind of compiled those and sent them to you, and then we can share that with everybody that was on the video today.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, I'm looking at the schedule. I'm sorry. I wrote it down wrong for myself. This is a problem, but I see that there is a 10-minute break or 15-minute break. I'd be happy to stay on for 15 minutes and answer questions, Courtney, if you would like to do that also.
I think just for the sake of time and wanting to give you a break too, and because there were so many great questions, we'll probably just send them all to you, and then we'll make sure to share the recording, your handouts, and the answers to the questions for everybody that signed up today.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Rhonda, Nese, and I had the pleasure of leading a discussion on alternatives to exclusionary discipline for the University of Washington Smart Center on Wednesday, December 2nd. There were questions that came through in the chat box that we didn't have the opportunity to answer live. So I have put the questions on a handy dandy PowerPoint slide, and I figure I would just make this video answering the questions for you all. I hope this is helpful. So the first question that we received was about some of the data that I was showing about the schools who had participated. And it says, what does the data of those higher rates of suspensions and expulsions show of the general populace of the community of those with higher exclusion rates? Do those schools exist in higher minority communities with higher crime, drug activity, thus have higher rates? And the answer to that is no. The schools that participated in that study were in a suburban area, a predominantly white area. They both had larger populations of students receiving free and reduced lunch, but these were certainly not cities that are considered high crime, high drug activity. No, just not a lot of preventative practices that were originally in place. The next question says, have you disaggregated the early study outcome data by students' race and ethnicity? And yes, we did. We also disaggregated the data by disability status. Unfortunately, with the talk, we have very little time, and so I just showed the aggregated data. for the outcomes. But yes, we did. And what we saw is that disproportionality in the use of exclusion reduced, as well as the overall drop in the use of exclusion. The same occurred for students receiving special education services. There was a reduction in the amount of exclusion that those students received after the schools implemented the ESLA process. The next question was about break systems that I had to brush through pretty quickly. And it says, for some of us, this sounds a little more like an out-of-class buddy room. Can Dr. Nese please speak to how important it is to look at data and reduce the use of out-of-class time? You are absolutely correct. What I was presenting is not an out-of-class buddy room. What we know is that being able to say, I need a break, or I'm feeling frustrated right now, is a really important coping strategy that people learn. And we oftentimes learn it by others giving us permission and teaching us it's okay to recognize. It's a really good strategy to say, I can't focus right now, may I take a break? And so what I was presenting were a systematized process for teaching students how they can request to take a break, and also for teachers to request when they need a break themselves, when there is an issue. This is not at all an encouragement of out-of-class buddy rooms or having students sit idle in a hallway doing nothing. Those strategies are completely ineffective. And it is very important for schools and teams to use data to assess how much out-of-class time students are missing, even with breaks, so that we can intervene early. And thus that plug for if a student asks to take a break 3 times in 1 week, that's an indicator that that student is probably in need of further supports. And that is a point in which we need to put a request for support to our tier 2 team or our behavior team to really assess, is it an academic issue that the student is trying to escape? Is there something about this class that is difficult for this student, or is something else going on? Okay, so some debrief questions. Someone had written, can you comment on when staff such as counselors say they are not part of discipline? I am a social worker and I'm often the supportive adult who does the debrief. You know, the goal is for discipline to not be seen as punitive discipline, but for students to be able to access the supports that they need. And that is why the process of debriefing and skills coaching and reconnecting is so important. Having social workers or other individuals, such as counselors, be a part of this process is so important because those individuals have received a lot of training in doing this work. That is also why we provide training to educational assistants and paraprofessionals in doing these supports, because oftentimes they're in these roles in which they've historically sat in, say, these in-school suspension rooms or detention rooms and have done nothing. And we're trying to move away from those models of students just sitting in rooms doing nothing, actually provide them support to get them back to class faster and with skills. So no, it's not about counselors and social workers not being a part of discipline. We are all a part of a team within a school to support students' learning and development, and that's both academic and social learning and development. The next question asks, during a restorative debrief, what does the debrief person do if through this process it's apparent that the skill lacking was the teachers, not the students? This is such a great question, and this has come up so much because you're absolutely right. There are many times in which we go through this process with students and it is clear that either an adult was being very harsh, or this was disproportionate discipline, or somebody's holding a grudge, or they overreacted. When we debrief with the students, we are never asking them to take ownership over what the teacher did. In fact, we use this process as a mechanism for also coaching the staff members and the teachers on how they own their piece of what happened, how they reconnect, how they make amends. So it's not all on the student's part. And so going through that debrief and identifying that it was the teacher and not the student is a perfect moment for an adult to be empathetic and to say to a student, you know, this is not all on you. And no situation really is. What part of this can we focus on? And then what part is for the teacher to own? But no, we are never asking students to apologize or take ownership of teachers' behavior and teachers' actions. It is about them reflecting on their own piece. Can Dr. Nese also speak to how we coach up teachers to avoid sending out the kiddos? What is the parallel process for teachers to debrief and use alternatives within the classroom? ISLA is all about this. It is all about helping teachers understand how to reduce their use of sending kids out. And first, we start off by really identifying that sending kids out of class is a really big deal that should be only reserved for students who need additional support outside of what the teacher can provide in the class. And that's why within the stairs that I presented of the ISLA model, we spend so much time on all classroom prevention. And that is building relationships, implementing effective responses to low-level behaviors, really focusing in on how we support kids within the classroom, because we don't want students being sent out. The out-of-class ISLA supports should be reserved for those students who need additional support that teachers cannot provide, and the support to get back and reconnect. But we spend a lot of time throughout the school year working with staff on strategies to implement preventative supports in the classroom and reduce their use of out-of-class discipline. This also goes into their piece of reconnecting. It is very important that it's not just the kid who's engaging in this process, but the teacher also taking ownership, reflecting on their piece, and them making amends with their students. Okay, ISLA model questions. Will we have access to the ISLA protocol or guidance model debrief cards, AKA the ISLA recipe? Yes. These materials are currently still under development as a part of a federally funded grant. When the grant is finalized, all of these materials will be published online and freely available. These are your tax-paying dollars hard at work. So all the materials will be made available. You can absolutely email me at rnese, that's RNESE, at uoregon.edu to access the preliminary materials, with the caveat that these materials are still under development and are still currently in being utilized in a pilot study and may be subject to change. But yes, you can have access to all of our ISLA materials. How can the ISLA model be modified for non-PBIS school districts that still have a heavy law enforcement SRO presence in schools? So ISLA was not developed specifically for PBIS schools. ISLA was developed to help schools move away from the use of exclusionary discipline practices, because we know that they harm students. And that goes for any school, especially schools with heavy law enforcement and SROs present in the school. My advice for those schools is to use the ISLA training materials to train up those individuals on how to reconnect, on how to be restorative, on how to support students with skill building, because we can shift and modify their role in schools. We can help inform their supports to be more supportive for students as opposed to punitive and just removing them from class. If we have that heavy presence, that is also indicative of more adults in the building. And so those adults can serve in supportive roles if we provide them the training and the coaching and the ability to provide those supports to kids, and utilizing SROs and law enforcement to help teachers and students make amends would be a really important shift in those historically punitive roles that they serve in schools. Can you share what the fidelity monitoring systems and tools look like for ISLA? Yes, these are also materials that will be made freely available, and you can access these now, even though these tools will still be subject to change and finalized as we further develop them and then make them available on our website. We collect fidelity in a few different ways. As you stated here, we have an implementation checklist that the team uses to guide the rollout of ISLA throughout the school. We have the ISLA observation fidelity tool, which is used when individuals go in, whether it's a principal or a researcher or anybody, to kind of observe the supports that these students are receiving. And then we have the self-report fidelity tool, which is the person who's providing ISLA supports to students. They indicate for each kiddo which components of ISLA they provided. So tracking fidelity of implementation is critical to our work, like it should be to any intervention implementation. And these tools are absolutely available for your use. Interested in the ISLA process for teachers, as in how we support teachers to reduce their use of sending kids out of class. We ask the kiddos how we avoid the behavior. How about teachers? I know I mentioned this earlier, but we spend a lot of time with our coaching model working directly with teachers on how they implement restorative practices within their classrooms, how they use systems of responding to low-level behaviors with low-level responses. We spend a lot of time on effective responses, on being supportive to students, on really understanding and recognizing the individuality and the human nature of making mistakes. And that goes both ways, because we have students who make mistakes and need to make amends, and we have adults who make mistakes and need to make amends. And so for ISLA, it's really a two-way street. We spend a lot of time on skill development with students because they are growing and developing. And so we owe it to them to teach them really fundamental behavioral and academic skills that they'll need for their entire life. But we also emphasize that teachers are in different places with their social skills too, right? Not every adult knows how to make amends. Not every adult knows how to respond calmly. Not every adult is trained in graduated discipline. And so that is a very, very critical component of our model and the amount of time that we spend training teachers, because ISLA is really about training adults to better support kids. Okay, other questions. I'm interested in the subsist measure from our sustainability grant. I'm wondering if there are any plans to adapt it for use with other evidence-based practices or to make it available for public use. Great question. The subsist tool, which has nothing to do with ISLA, but is it's a part of our research. The subsist tool was not developed specifically for PBIS. It was developed to be used to assess implementation and sustainability of any universal evidence-based practice. And now we are in our second iteration of grant funding that is looking at a measure of assessing the sustainability of tier 2 and tier 3 evidence-based interventions. So the subsist tool can be used across any universal evidence-based intervention, not just PBIS. And the checklist, I will provide the subsist checklist to the Smart Center and they can post it for accessibility, as well as some of our ISLA materials. Also, Dr. Kent McIntosh at the University of Oregon really led this work. And if you're interested in participating in the research aspect of it, he is the right person to get in touch with. His email is kentm, K-E-N-T-M, at uoregon.edu. I am sure he will be thrilled that I shared his email here. Okay, could you give examples of how these strategies would be integrated into strategic plans in the following areas, in addition to MTSS and PBIS? Equity programs, attendance, truancy, and also specific workshops and support for staff who are wanting to implement this work. I think it is so important with strategic plans or any action plans that you're developing at a district or school level to look at the different supports, the different interventions you're doing, and figure out how they braid together. So addressing exclusionary discipline and developing, like ISLA, alternatives to exclusionary discipline goes hand in hand with your restorative practices work. It goes hand in hand with your plans for sustainability of PBIS or MTSS, and it certainly goes hand in hand with addressing attendance and truancy. But we have to be specific about how these things really address these components that we want to change and the outcomes that we want to get at. So what I would recommend is when you are working with your team on strategic planning or on action planning for the following year, map out and make a table of the different interventions or initiatives that you have going in your school, and then list the commonalities, essentially where they braid together. And then the next step is to address what are the outcomes that we want to impact. With these interventions, are we trying to improve attendance? Are we trying to improve academics? Are we trying to improve equity in our discipline practices? That is the best way to integrate this work into your strategic planning. This question says, I've been an educator for 25 years, an administrator for 10. I've implemented PBIS in the 3-tiered system. I've used RTI practices, parental supported plans, SPED supports, para-educated supports, etc. I still am compelled to seek your opinion on strategies to help disengage students who still will not comply or buy into the systems we have tried. I know there isn't a one-size-fits-all, and our teams try really hard to modify, redirect, replan, develop the relationships, etc. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. This is such a thoughtful question, and I hear you and I feel you. Unfortunately, you're right. There is not a one-size-fits-all, and ISLA, like any other intervention, is not a silver bullet. This is something that we implement within a multi-tiered system of support, because we know, as I had shared, that ISLA is tier 1 plus, right? We start with all of these really important universal supports, and then we layer on top of it. But in this process, it is made clear who this is not working for and who needs additional supports on top of what we're providing. So my recommendation is to continue to work with teams within a multi-tiered system of support, so you can identify the students who truly need individualized, targeted supports to help with their specific needs. There are absolutely students who, regardless of what you try, and for many reasons, may be disengaged, like maybe not engaged at all in the school environment, or not bought into systems. And so especially with those students, I would say bringing them to the table and talking to them about what it is that they need. What supports do they feel that they would benefit from? Having them lead the team, having them really be at the forefront. This is student-centered. So having them be at the forefront of developing the supports and really identifying what it is that they need and how we can be of service to them is the best strategy possible. But it also sounds like you've been in education a long time and you have tried a lot of these things. And you know that sometimes we just have to continue to think outside of the box and go above and beyond for those few students who really, really, really are struggling. And this question, which I believe is our last question, says, how should administrators address teachers' feelings when teachers feel administrators aren't doing enough to discipline? And my response is to say to educators, you know, when we look at exclusionary practices, the important question that we have to ask ourselves is this working for us? Is this working for our students? Meaning the students who've been excluded, the students who've been kicked out of class or have received suspension. Is this working for them? And by working, I mean, are they doing better academically? Is their behavior better? Like, did the exclusion actually result in improvements? And if the answer is no, then that is your reason for saying that is why we're trying a different strategy, because we have learned that our traditional systems of exclusion or punitive punishment don't actually improve student behaviors and student outcomes. And so we are taking a discipline system that teaches, restores, and gives students the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, as opposed to just removing them and thinking that the removal of the student is the thing that's going to change them. Because we know from national data, we know from historical data, we know from anecdotal data that that just doesn't work. So that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for attending the workshop. Thank you for watching this video and for sharing your questions. I appreciate you, and I appreciate all the supports you provide to our students.